Hey, everybody. Welcome to Verified Investing. My name is Gareth Soloway, Chief Market Strategist here. In today's video, we are going to deep dive into the chart of Nvidia. Not only are we going to look at the daily time frame, but we're going to then expand out to the weekly and the monthly. Now, that's important because you get a longer term view from going on a bigger time frame. So again, it's not just about what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, which would be the daily chart, but ultimately, what about the next few months? What about the next year? That's where we look into the chart daily, weekly, and monthly time frames. So let's dive right in here and take a gander. And what we can see is Nvidia has been in a long-term uptrend. Well, not so long-term, but basically since April 7th, we had a low here on Nvidia of around $87, and it has ballooned to about $185. Now, today it's basically flat on the day, not much going on here. But what I do see right off the bat is a trend line that starts right here at the low on April 7th and connects right through this low here and even through these current lows. Now, look at this, guys. This is impressive because basically what we have here is a trend line that gives us, just like the word says, a trend, low to low to low. And here again, kissed it here, tagged it here, and even over here. Now, what this tells me is that the trend is intact as long as the trend line does not break. If we break below this, the trend stops. In addition, this chart has led the stock market higher. And I would dare caution people and say, if you want to know when the stock market turns down, watch for when Nvidia breaks this trend line. Now, where's the trend line currently sitting? Right now, it's around 179 to 180. Obviously, it's upsloping, so it'll increase slightly over the course of time, right? So over time, it will inch up a little bit each day. And again, we have to adjust our breakdown point to that current level. So let's say it broke down tomorrow. Let's go to where tomorrow's candle would be. That would be about a break of $180. And so what we know again is if it breaks below there, it breaks the trend, and then you start having bigger falls. Basically, it goes over the cliff and starts to tank down a little bit. Now, listen, there will be supports along the way. There's a big gap fill right here at 164. That would be my first big support level. In addition, where you have the previous all-time highs right here, this would be a major, major support where you could even play it as a long swing trade at 152 to 153. And again, notice this high and this high, they're basically a pivot point. As a technician, when it starts to break down, I would put a trend line right there and say, okay, here would be a little stopping point for a small bounce, maybe here as well. But really, once it gets here, look for a bigger bounce. And then you have to wait for that line to break for the next leg to the downside beyond that, if it should ever come. All right, so this is your daily chart. So the daily chart right now, based on this analysis, has a upside bias or neutral to upside. Now, I would say neutral to upside versus just plain out upside, because it's already so extended. Now, what tells me that it's extended? Well, if we flip up the RSI, this is a concerning factor. Now, listen, you still have to keep a neutral to upside bias because it's holding this trend line. But look at the negative divergence that's starting to build on the chart. So here, right? So right here, we had a high on Nvidia before this little pullback. Here's your high on the RSI. There's your pullback. Then we had a secondary high right here. And look, this was lower. So you have a high, higher high, okay? And then you have a high, lower high, and even lower here, even though we're essentially at that same top. This is again referred to as a negative divergence in the RSI. That means that essentially time is slowly ticking and winding down to a point where you do expect a trend line break. So yes, it's still holding the uptrend, but there are many, many warning signs on the daily chart here that we must pay attention to and that are telling us that time is slowly running out. All right, let's erase these lines. Let's go to our weekly chart. Now, the weekly chart is remarkable because look at how vertical this has gone. Historically, this is probably the last time it was this vertical: 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10, 11 greens in a row. Here you obviously have a much longer move to the upside. This was a move from about $49 to $97, so about a $50 move. And this has been 87 to 185, almost $100 move to the upside. So almost double this move right here to the upside. So needless to say, it is extremely, extremely overdone. Now let's also look at the RSI. The RSI, again, you can see that we've been kind of grinding. We've gotten into the overbought level. But remember, RSI doesn't tell us that just because something's overbought doesn't tell us it's done running, right? So here, it was overbought here. And look, it continued up for a long period of time. So what you're really looking for is the negative divergences, right? That's where you start to say, okay, something's intact here. Something bigger is falling. Okay, so we don't have that on the weekly chart at this point because of the long move. You've now taken everything out. In addition, generally the RSI resets if it gets below 50 here. And you can see it did get below 50 as well. So this is no RSI divergence, but we have an extremely extended price. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is, do we have any sort of trend lines here? And I would dare say you do. Look at this. Look at this underbelly trend line, guys. This is a very, very cool trend line here. And what I want to show you on this is, here's your low. Here's a pierce, but notice it opened below, but then recaptured on the same weekly candle. Then it tagged here. Then it tagged here. Then it kind of pierced, got back above, broke. And then look at this, guys. See right here how you broke or you retraced to the scene of the crime where it was rejected. So this tells me this trend line is important. And lo and behold, 3 weeks in a row, we've now hammered on this line. So this should be resistance. And just based, even without RSI divergences, you don't need RSI divergences, but this would tell me that it's getting close to the end of its run. And there's probably limited upside left on Nvidia because it's into that trend line. And you can see how well it used this as support. And then once it broke, hit, pulled back. And here it is hitting again. We assumed that it would have a pullback as well. All right. And lastly, so again, I would rate this as still an uptrend in the short term on Nvidia's weekly, but it is getting close to a bigger correction. Also, this chart here, the first support line, notice you don't have the same gap fills because those aren't big left. The first support line would be right here, which is that place 153-ish, where we said you could look for a bounce if it pulls back there on the chart, a trade opportunity. Lastly, let's go to the monthly. Now, the monthly is interesting because notice this. You do have a negative divergence on the RSI. Here you have a high, higher high, and higher high right there. Here you have a high, lower high, lower high, high, lower high, lower high. So there is a very strong negative divergence on the RSI on the monthly chart. That is a bearish signal on Nvidia. And then the other thing I would just like to point out here, let's erase these lines, is you actually have a beautiful, let's get rid of this here. Let's collapse that back down. If you take this high, which was your bull market high in 2021, November, and you look at this trend line, all of a sudden it's forming. Like, whoa, holy cow. That is unbelievable. So remember, we had that trend line on the weekly. You also have a trend line on the monthly going back to 2021. The highest pivot, and again, notice this, guys. This is important. It goes up and then it goes down. That's what makes a pivot. It's the highest point when you have a move up and then a move down. All right. Then you had this up move here and a pullback there. Then you had an up move there right into that line again and it pulled back there. So ultimately, our job as technicians is to keep emotion out of it and say, okay, well, now we've come up here and we're hitting this even more extended with a negative divergence. What is the likelihood move here? It would be a pullback. So again, daily chart is still holding that same trend line, right? So we had that daily chart with that underbelly trend line still holding. So very short term, like the next day or 2 or 3 days, still neutral to bullish bias. But weekly, monthly, and when that daily breaks that trend line, that's where things get troublesome for Nvidia. Watch for that break. It's right around 179, 180. Remember that will creep a little bit higher, but you get that break, Nvidia probably drops back to 153, at which point you would look for a significant bounce. All right, guys, this has been your Nvidia analysis here. Don't forget, folks, if you want exact entries, exits, daily videos, small cap trading, all of that stuff, and even ETF trading, join Smart Money Stocks and ETFs. It's all we do, folks. We're swing traders. We follow charts. No BS, just charts. Join us here at Verified Investing, Smart Money Stocks and ETFs for exact entry and exits on swing trades. Have a great rest of your day, guys. Take